Abby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be here.
All right. So I want to take you back to the late 90s and working for Hot 97 Radio. You were asked to create a logo for their new hip-hop station. And, you know, my judgment here, you were probably not 100% up on the nuances of hip-hop culture. How do you even begin designing something like that if you're not deeply connected to it?
Interesting story. I was hired by Rocco McRae, who was then the promotion director for Hot 97, and he was working for Judy Ellis, who was the general manager. And initially, the brief was not to redesign the identity. So in fact, there's a couple of places online that say that I created the first round of the Hot 97 logo, the redesign, and I didn't. That was Say Adams. So Rocco worked with Say to develop this new identity. It was sort of black and white and very scratchy, very kind of late 80s, early 90s. And what happened was Judy Ellis was interested in repositioning the radio station, and that's really where I came in. And it was her belief that the world was ready and needed a hip-hop radio station. There hadn't been any at that time, up until the early 90s. And she wanted to create the first one. At the time, Hot 97 was a dance music radio station. And so she was sure that the dance music radio station could make a transition to a hip-hop station. The station didn't have a lot of money, and there really wasn't a strong belief that something like this could happen. And so what we did was Rocco, Judy, a man named Johan Vipper, who was my partner in crime at the time in the creative area, and Say did the logo. And we had an open call, and I believe it was at the Palladium. I might have the place wrong, but we had an open call on the radio to have people come and be models in this new radio station that we were creating. And we got actually Angie Martinez, who was then Judy Ellis's assistant, who then became a very, very well-known DJ on Hot 97. She was part of that original casting. And so we had all sorts of listeners, different sizes, different ages, different races, different bodies, everything that we could do to show the best and most diverse group of people that were listening to the station. And they were dancing, and at that point, we started to move the tagline into Hot 97 hip-hop, and that was when it started to first change. But it wasn't the full-on change yet. It was just the beginning of a morphing to that. And so for me, it really wasn't about, I don't know that much about hip-hop, and how do I create something authentic? For me, it was listening to my clients at the time who were interested in doing this and then helping them make that repositioning. And so the idea that we had featuring real people, real listeners, real people that worked at the station, that was what helped. And then as we started to get our foothold in changing the format to hip hop and R&B, then we started to engage the artists that we were playing on the radio station. So Notorious B.I.G. and Sean Combs, who was at that point Puffy and then Puff Daddy, the Fugees, Lauryn Hill, Brandy, all of these artists, Lil' Kim, we used the actual artists and took original photography and then let them represent the station in as an authentic manner as possible. It was an incredible time. So I very quickly learned a lot about hip hop, and what's interesting, having a black wife, every now and then an old school hip hop song will come on the radio and I'll start singing along. I know every word, and she's like, what?
So you know it and she doesn't.
No, she knows it too, but she's always
She's just in shock that you know it.
yeah, that, I'm this like white Jewish girl from Long Island, because I did spend years on Long Island as well, knowing the song to, knowing the lyrics to, every Notorious B.I.G. song or something like that.
That's so funny. Jay-Z and Eminem were talking once in some
we did
interview.
shoot with Eminem also, which was amazing.
Oh, I bet that was incredible.
Yeah, incredible.
And they were saying like their listenership crosses. Like Jay-Z has more white listeners and Eminem has more black listeners. It's really it's really interesting how they speak to the different demographics. I'd like to talk a bit about Burger King because you are certainly famously known for that. You worked a redesign of Burger King's logo when you're shifting somebody's brands to a new look and a new feel. What sorts of things are important for you to understand in advance of that?
Why does this company want to do this? And I did initially the first round of Hot 97 work I did on my own. The second round of Hot 97 work I did at Sterling Brands when I started to work there and ultimately run the design division. And the work at Burger King was also at Sterling. So very proud work representing the company that I helped build and still love. So with Burger King, it was really, why do you want to do this? Why do you need to do this? Why does the world need another redesigned fast food restaurant? And my feeling is that every redesign needs to signify some sort of change that is being marked by this redesign. If it's an internally driven change, then consumers are going to be super confused about why you're doing something, why you need to do it. And it really needs to signify some bigger change that the logo is representative of. And in the case of Burger King, it was redesigned stores. So Fitch did a redesign on the architecture of all the stores globally. And so it made sense at that point to essentially polish up the logo because that was signifying that the restaurants had a new look, from the top down, so to speak.
That's interesting. And when you asked the why question, I guess my question is, how much time do you spend in the psychographics, if I'm using that word correctly, in sort of like, when I think about a logo, I just get this image of, the Starbucks logo or something, this little small tiny thing. Mm-hmm. But I don't think about somebody sitting there and saying, why is the Mobil logo or the Exxon logo or the Starbucks logo or the Burger King logo designed like this? Is that a big chunk of what your discussions are like prior to doing it, like getting into that DNA before you even, take a paintbrush to it?
Oh, of course. You have to understand the origin story, and there is an origin story for every identity. But that origin story is only brought to life by marketing. I often ask, or I often ask my clients, is it the mark or is it the marketing? Because you can look at something like the Nike swoosh, which is ubiquitous and probably known globally by nearly everyone. But if you turn that logo upside down, it's actually the Newport cigarettes logo. And if you turn it on its side, it is the logo for Capital One Bank. I see you already looking.
No, I'm writing this down because I don't want to forget this because I'm using this in my intro because that is fascinating to me. Yeah. The Newport cigarettes and the Capital One, if you just rotate.
It's all this sort of same swooshy shape. So if Nike hadn't put $100 million of marketing behind it every year, would it be as ubiquitous? Would it be as much an identifier of that brand? In fact, when Phil Knight saw it, I talk about this in my TED Talk. He saw it and he was like, well, I don't love it, but I think it'll grow on me. So it grew on him, all right.
Well, with $100 million of budget behind him, it probably grows pretty easily.
Well, there still has to be a cohesive plan around that. You can't just throw money at a refrigerator and hope that some of it will stick. There needs to be a reason that you're directing the money in certain areas, and it still has to have something that will resonate deeply with people in a very human way. And it's not just about the money or the mark. It's really a combination.
Has there been something that you've done that was a flop, and you look back and you're like, I don't know why this thing flopped. Like, it's got all of the right components, but it just didn't work, and I don't know why.
It's so funny. That reminds me of Cher being asked the question, what is your biggest song regret? And she's like, I don't ever understand, not that I'm Cher, but she very famously said, she never understood why the song Walking in Memphis, which she recorded, didn't become a big hit. It ultimately became a big hit for others, but it never became a big hit for her. And by all intents and purposes, it should have, right? It's a great song. She did a great version of it. But in terms of timing, I think the biggest failure was work that I did in the late 90s, mid to late 90s on Snapple. Mm-hmm. And we were super excited about the project. It's a huge brand. It had 1 million flavors, and it's a really, really big job. I was a big Snapple fan at the time. And we did something that was just way too modern. It had a big silver band on the package. We sharpened the edges of the S in Snapple, so the top the little tail on the top of the S is something that is very sharp, and I softened it without telling them. I just wanted to see if they'd notice it, so it looked a little bit more swirly like a snake, and they hated it and didn't go with it, but I thought it just looked much better. It was much more symmetrical. However, that it was a real failure, super failure.
Is there one conversely where you're like, they want it, but I don't think it's going to work, and it did?
Well, I wouldn't say that they want it and it did. I was really surprised by the response of the Tropicana redesign, when consumers were just like insane and hating the package that had gone to market, and saying and demanding the old pack back. I mean, I remember talking to Paula Scher about it, and she's like, it's a nice pack, but it's not that nice. It's typical Paula. And in fact, she was more concerned at the time that acquiescing and bringing back the package was going to be bad for design, because it was going to make clients be less willing to take a risk, because if consumers had that outcry because Pepsi Cola, which owns Tropicana, brought the pack back so soon that it was going to show other potential clients, when their redesign doesn't always work, to give in to defeat as opposed to stand and hold your ground. And, there are companies now that do stand and hold their ground. Almost every logo now that's redesigned is met with wrath and hatred. But my feeling is that if you keep it out long enough, people will become accustomed to it. The Airbnb logo is a great example, where when it first came out, people thought it looked like female genitalia or male genitalia, and those two genitalias look different. So, how much do you listen to the outrage when now almost any change is met with outrage? So I was surprised, but I'm still, here it is now, almost 20 years later since that outrage first happened. And Tropicana, that package is still the package that we designed over 20 years ago. So it makes me really, really happy when I see that the work that I contributed to has that much resonance with people that they don't actually want it ever to change.
It's interesting. Now it's becoming, instead of new, now it's becoming sort of iconic and legendary as time passes.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. I want to ask you something that is probably a little bit out of your area of expertise, but I'm curious about your thoughts. And that is, do you remember when Coca-Cola changed their formula?
Oh, yeah.
And people went apeshit, right? You remember that?
I do.
What is your comments at all on that? In other words, was it marketing? Did somebody screw up? Was it intentional? Like, what do you think, knowing what you know now, was going on at that time?
Well, I know a lot about what happened. I ended up working at the agency that did that redesign and worked on the reformulation, but I didn't get there until after it had happened. Um, it's a very, very interesting story. This is something that was based on Coca. First of all, it wasn't intentional. They didn't do this so that there would be this outcry and people would rediscover how much they liked classic Coke. This was done because Coca-Cola was losing some market share to Pepsi-Cola. And Pepsi-Cola had a slightly sweeter formula. And so Coca-Cola thought, well, if we're losing market share to a slightly sweeter formula, maybe we should have a slightly sweeter formula too. Now, they did a tremendous amount of market research on this, just oodles and oodles of market research. But what they did was primarily do blind taste testing. So giving consumers two beverages to taste, not with association with any brand or logo. And so when they did the blind taste tests, people overwhelmingly liked the sweeter version. So that gave Coca-Cola the courage and the confidence to make that change. But there's so much value to the intangible assets of a brand beyond flavor and form that they didn't understand the relationship that people had to the brand. And therefore, when it was changed, people went just ballistic. I remember my dad at the time was a huge Coca-Cola fan. He was so worried about this happening, he went and hoarded cases of Coca-Cola in our basement because that's how much he loved Coca-Cola.
I mean, it became a lesson for people in the future, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, it became a huge lesson. But it's not necessarily the market research that led them astray. It was the way in which the market research was conducted. Because you can look at, and I've studied this a great deal, you can look at very robust market research giving you very specific direction on how to move a brand and find out that it's pretty much horseshit, that consumers don't want what they've told you they think you are asking them to tell you. So there's a great case of robust market research, utter failure as a brand, where market research said this is going to be a huge success. And then you have something like Absolute Vodka. Absolute Vodka was tested prior to being launched. And consumers were like, what's with this bottle? They didn't understand it. They didn't like it. They didn't think that it was something that was interesting. People didn't want a vodka from Sweden. But Michel Leroux, who was then the brand manager, decided to launch it anyway. And that bottle is now one of the most iconic bottles in all of beverage history. In fact, it's one of the longest running ad campaigns of our time. So there's an example where market research said, this is going to be a failure, but launched anyway and was a super, super success. So you can't always rely on market research because you can't always rely on humans being consistent and humans telling you the truth and humans not necessarily knowing what they need as opposed to what they want.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our mutual friend Tim Ferriss talks about focus groups, and he says until you do a focus group and you pull up after the focus group meeting is over with your car and pop your trunk open and say, "Do you want to buy one?" You don't really know whether or not they're telling you the truth. So.
I mean, I'm not a big fan of focus groups. There's a very strong group dynamic that occurs. There's there are always the people pleasers that want to get along with everybody and do what everybody else does. There's always the archetypal rebel who just wants to be cantankerous and be vehemently opposed to whatever it is you're doing. Then there are the professional focus group attendees who make a living attending focus groups.
Right.
So it's a very slippery slope. Focus groups are really problematic. I'm much more interested in ethnographic research where you're actually living with somebody and watching them and observing them, because common vocabulary does not always equate with common behavior. I remember being on an ethnographic research study, and we were trying to understand people's relationship to health food. And I remember walking into somebody's kitchen and a woman telling me how involved with fitness she was and how she really cared about her body and really only wanted to eat healthy and natural. And then, we asked to see her cabinets and her refrigerator and her pantry. And, it was full of things like healthy choice and lean cuisine and diet Pepsi. And those, that was her idea of healthy. And so we all have our own definitions and interpretations of what it means to live a certain kind of life. And that has to be taken into account when working on any brand and doing any kind of market research study.
Yeah, you must have did the ethnographic research on my mother, because that's exactly, every time I talk to her, it's like, well, I eat good. And I'm like, I've seen your cabinets. You don't. It's a giant neurotoxin waiting to happen.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, switching gears, I want to talk to you about Hillary Clinton's campaign. Can you tell us how you found yourself designing, I believe, her campaign button?
Well, Jennifer Kynan, who worked and still works at her own agency with her business partner, Bobby Martin, they have a business called Champions Design. At the time, it was called Original Champions of Design, but they changed it recently. She took a leave of absence at Champions to go and work for Hillary Clinton as her design director. And because of our relationship in the branding community, she also does mentoring with my grad students at the School of Visual Arts. And our friendship, she asked me if I'd be interested in designing buttons. And so I did. I designed buttons for Hillary. I've actually done quite a lot of work for the Biden campaign in the last few months. Much more work for the Biden campaign than I did for the Hillary Clinton campaign. I gave them some advice on positioning and graphics in addition to working on the campaign buttons. But with the Biden campaign, I've actually done quite a lot more.
And how have you enjoyed working on the Biden campaign? I mean, not that her campaign was not certainly heated, because it was, but this one is like nothing I've ever seen. Like, what is it like being even sort of like tangentially involved in this?
Well, Rob, I don't know when this is going to air. I'm going to assume, given we're 4 days before the election.
It'll be after. Yeah, it'll be after.
Yesterday I wrote on Twitter that I'm suffering from pre-election stress disorder. And I really am. I really started to become affected by the world at large and what was happening back in March. The perfect storm of the election, the pandemic, the civil unrest, the police killings of Black people. It just became so incredibly overwhelming. I needed to start wearing a mouth guard because I was just destroying my teeth at night while I was sleeping. I was so full of anxiety. And I've never actually felt so worried about the future, so unsure of what's going to come, so demoralized by what has happened. And I'm holding on to this slim hope of the arc of justice bending in the direction that we need it to. because frankly, I don't know what we're going to do if it doesn't. I think we're going to see civil unrest unlike anything we've seen since the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I really truly feel that democracy will have failed. So I think there's a lot riding on this. I am obsessed and consumed by what is happening right now.
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly it was beautifully said, and I think we are all going through this as well. I've literally had to work with a therapist because I was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning with panic attacks. Like I was asleep, and I just get up at 3 a.m., my heart pounding out of my chest.
Yeah.
Feel like I have no history of anything like this. It is just this never-ending situation that it's just not going away. And I'm finding myself in just such a weird state. Like we were at dinner the other night here in LA, and I live in Hermosa, and we have mask police that are walking around, and they go in threes, and they just stop you, and if you don't have a mask on, they write you a ticket. And it's like I'm getting this sort of like flashes of like North Korea, and like it's just so. I mean, I'm 54. I've never ever seen anything like this in my life. I mean, so all we can do is pray that this changes. I hope this is going to be better than it has been. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I really am so scared. I've never felt like this before, Rob. I've never felt so scared.
I know. Well, we got to put some positive energy out into the world.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll change some
yeah, I mean, that's really the only thing that's helping is actually acting and doing and mobilizing and putting out whatever I can put out there to encourage people to vote and to think about the ramifications of our planet if we can't get this one right.
I hope we do. You're extraordinarily articulate. You're extraordinarily gifted at what you do. Where do you think that comes from? In other words, if I met, the 20-year-old Debbie Millman, would she be different?
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, she'd be very different. Well, thank you for those very kind words. I'm blushing, and flattery will get you everywhere. The 20-year-old Debbie. Well, I've been in therapy now for 30 years. So actually 1 year more than half my life. So I think that the 20-year-old Debbie would probably still have at her core the optimism and hope and drive and ambition. But she would be much more insecure and a lot more confused and a lot more self-destructive and a lot more caught up in the trauma of the previous 20 years, which was still super fresh and really unexamined. And so that would be a big part of what you'd pick up on.
Yeah, you got to do the work, don't you?
Yeah.
You stepped into the world of podcasting on your own here with your Design Matters show, which now, drum roll please, has surpassed 5 million downloads. Congratulations.
Well, that's a year. I mean, it's been millions and millions at this point.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, we're getting at about 500,000 downloads a month at this point. But that's things like, Tim Ferriss's or the TED Radio Hour. Those are small numbers compared, but it's still numbers that I'm really, really, really proud of.
You should be. Who the heck can compare themselves to Tim Ferriss? He does the work of 10 men. He's unbelievable. What was the goal with the podcast when you started, and how has that evolved? Well,
the goal with the podcast was to try to bring creativity that I had felt prior to working in branding. And prior to working in branding, I had been kind of unsuccessful at anything. And I just sort of went from thing to thing, hoping and sort of praying that I would find my way.
Yep.
And I hit branding, which was quite by accident. I found out very quickly that I did have a natural ability to it. I don't know if it was because I had spent years working in my father's pharmacy as I was growing up and being in contact with people that were constantly buying things for themselves or their families, and talking to my dad about what kind of drugs they needed to get, or what type of remedies they needed. So I had that experience, and when I went into branding, suddenly it felt very natural. I was very good at it very quickly. And it was the first time in my life, and here I am in my early to mid 30s, that I was actually ever good at anything. And so at that point, I stopped doing anything I wasn't good at and just put all my energy into doing the one thing I was good at. And that worked for a really long time, over a decade. And then I started to feel like my creative spirit was dying, and I wanted to try to get back to doing something that was self-generated, that didn't have a P&L associated to it, that I didn't have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And so I was offered an opportunity with Voice America Business Network. They called me and asked me if I'd be interested in creating an online radio show. And I thought they were offering me a job, but they weren't. They were actually offering me an opportunity to pay them to produce a show for me. But again, at the time, I was, double income, no kids, and felt like this would be an interesting way to try my hand at something that was creative, that I could have a little bit more freedom with, and no client. And so I decided to do that, and I did it, and I paid to have it done for 4 years. I did 100 episodes with Voice America. And then I was asked by the late, great Bill Drentel to bring the show to Design Observer, but with a proviso that I improved the sound quality. And so he helped me find a producer, Curtis Fox, who I started working with in 2009. We've been working together ever since. And then just recently, I joined the TED Audio Collective. So the TED folks that run and own the TED conference, have started a podcast network. And so Design Matters is part of that inaugural class of podcasts that have joined the TED group. So
come on, how cool is that?
It's really cool. It's so cool.
That's crazy. That
crazy.
Is so crazy.
It's surreal.
Have you seen this story with Joe Rogan going over to Spotify? Have you heard about it?
I've heard about it, but I don't know too many of the details. Can you share them with me?
150 million if you go to Spotify. Can you imagine? Wow.
That's a lot.
It's the highest ever for a podcast. I mean, that is how big podcasting is getting right now.
Yeah. Who would have thought? It's
Who would have thought?
I started it, there was not even a podcast section on iTunes. My friend Brian Gomez Palacio was frustrated by the fact that my show on Voice America was broadcast live and then rerun at some, middle of the night time slot. And so unless she heard it live at that one time, she couldn't listen. So she's like, why don't you upload it to iTunes? Because this way, like an indie musician, I can just download it when I want. And so that's what I did. And then when the podcast section started, it was part of that. I remember there being a top 100 podcast list, and mine was like 85, but I think there were like 105 podcasts. So yeah, there's only a handful of podcasts now, probably less than 10, maybe even less than 5, that are still been continuously broadcasting since 2004, 2005.
Fascinating. Okay, as we wrap, I'm gonna go around to some questions. Some of them may be weird, but before I get into the weird questions, I want to ask you. You mentioned that you recently were married to a gal. I believe her name is Roxanne. Is that right?
Roxanne Gay.
All right. And because of this pandemic, you wanted to have a more proper reception, so you're going to hold it off till 2021.
We hope so.
We hope so. Fingers crossed. And you want to have, rumor has it, and I bet that this is already locked down, but here's my question. Is Gloria Steinem going to be doing your ceremony?
Yes.
How does one get Gloria Steinem to marry them?
Well, it helps if the person you're marrying has written a New York Times best-selling book called Bad Feminist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we could just leave that one right there. Um,
It's
we'll.
not 'cause it's because of her.
All right. We'll link that up in the show notes. What is on your nightstand?
On my nightstand right now is 2 nearly empty bottles of kombucha, a tripod, my paper calendar, my iPad, a magazine called, just get it out, a magazine called Foreign Sons, and then a Parquet catalog, which features some great art in it, and an insert by Christopher Wool. So I have a background, so it's a little hard to see.
Okay.
An eye patch for sleeping, the coolest digital clock I've ever seen, which Roxanne got me, which at night you can turn the light completely off and it projects on the ceiling. So
Whoa!
the light is on the ceiling, which is incredible. A little plant that my friend Lisa Congdon cut from my garden and started put in a little vase that she had made. And so now it's rooted and it's growing. A box of tissues and a piece of ceramics that I made with a quote of Virginia Woolf.
You have the biggest nightstand I've ever seen in my life.
Actually not, it's just piled.
It's piled.
It's piled.
What does fulfillment look like for you at this stage of your life?
It's a great question. Just right now. I feel very lucky as I've gotten older. Yesterday was my 59th birthday, so
Happy birthday.
I was having dinner with Roxanne and another family member, and I made a toast and I said, I'm the happiest I've ever been in my life. So I know that there's a lot of fear and doom and gloom and inequality and injustice, but I'm working really hard in my own life to help combat that, help eradicate the rape kit backlog, help eradicate sexual violence towards women, help to create more equality for everyone. And even with all of the injustice in the world, at the end of the day, I do feel like I'm doing as much as I possibly can to make things better. And that's a really important thing in my life. And, for the first time in my life at 50, so I got married at 58. I mean, I was married before, but it didn't last. I feel like I've finally met the love of my life, and I came out when I was 50. So, it's been a long time to get here. Mm-hmm. And so I'll quote David Lee Roth on my podcast. I asked him what it felt like in the 1980s to be the biggest rock star in the world. Everybody all over the world knew him. He was it. He was the it man of the moment, and couldn't have possibly gotten any bigger. And he said to me that you have to be careful when you reach the top of the mountain, because you're almost always alone. It's really cold, and there's only one direction. And so he sort of warned that, we all want to peak really fast, make it. But then what? And so I've decided that this slow pace that I've taken with my life to get to where I've gotten is just fine for me. and I don't really want to peak until I die, until the day before I die. The day before I die, I can peak.
Yeah, right. And then check out. David Lee Roth has got to be one of the most interesting characters ever. He's fascinating. He was just on CBS Sunday Morning last week talking about his. I'm going to butcher this, but it's like Japanese painting, drawing things. I don't know what they're called.
Tattooing. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. And it's nice to see. We're roughly the same age. I'm 54, so like I remember David Lee Roth. So seeing him, as a mature man that's painting is just, it's just so interesting. I love that. Yeah. What is one thing that you have not gotten to in your life that if you don't get to this, you're going to have some massive regret?
Illustrated version of James Joyce's Ulysses.
Interesting. That one came out of left field. That's interesting. Why?
Well, yeah, because I've been thinking about this a lot. If not now, when? When do you start to do the things that you've always said you wanted to do? And so the reason I could say this fairly quickly is because it's on a list of things that I've written out, which are, if not now, when? Because, you could keep saying, I wanna, eventually, and then you turn 60 and it's like, what the fuck? I have to start.
Right.
So, James Joyce is one of my favorite authors. I years and years ago went to Dublin for Bloomsday, which is the day that James Joyce's character Ulysses spends over the course of the book. And so I had the James Joyce Ulysses breakfast, and I went out to Sandy Mount Strand and did all these things. And it's really just one of my favorite books of all time, and it's out of copyright. So, I could do an illustrated version of it. And so that's what I've been thinking about doing. Eventually.
I love that. I believe that people should do more things that they love to do and less of the things that they don't love to do. What are some things that you're currently doing that you really don't love to do and you would love to do less of?
Mm-hmm. Fulfilling obligations that I do to people please as opposed to please myself. I feel guilty if I don't say yes to people. I feel guilty if I don't say yes to my family for everything that they need and want. So I feel guilty a lot. That's what I'd like to stop feeling. I'd like to stop feeling guilty for not living up to people's expectations of me.
What do people often get wrong about you?
That I'm confident.
That one came quick. What would your friends say is one of your superpowers?
I can write mirror backwards. Really, I can write frontwards and backwards with both hands like a conductor at the same time.
That is a party trick. I love that. What do people never ask you but you wish they did?
That's a remarkable question.
Thank you.
How do you think the universe was created?
Do you have an answer?
No, but it would be
That's awesome. Okay, 2 more questions. What is your guilty pleasure?
My guilty pleasure is my wife's cooking. It's not so much guilty pleasure, it's just that she cooks so much that I love to eat everything that she makes. My guilty pleasure, aside from eating her baked goods, would be watching reruns of Law and Order SVU, even though I've seen every single episode about 43 times.
That's awesome. I do that with The West Wing. It's therapy for me. Yes. Last question. We'll change things up a little bit. What one question would you like to ask me?
Ooh. What are you afraid of?
First answer that popped in my head is getting old. And if I unpack that, it would be dying. If I unpack that, it would be leaving, not being here to see my 6-year-olds live a long, healthy life. I was thinking the other day, my mom's in her 80s now. She's still in Queens. And I'm 54. She's still alive, and I still have a relationship with her. That math won't translate for my daughter. And so, every time I could sneak some push-ups in and a vegetable in me, I'm doing it for that reason. But that would be the answer.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you. Well, Debbie, this is everything that I hoped it would be. I am truly honored that you said yes again. This meant a lot to me. I knew this was going to be amazing. Do you have any final words, suggestions, or an ask for people listening?
Vote.
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 Go vote.
And if
go
it doesn't go the way we want to, we have to take it to the street.
I just took my wife. I was doing podcasts all morning. She just took our 5-year-olds out to the voting booth because we wanted her to experience what it's like out there. So we had a voting. Put her in a little voting outfit, and she went to the polls today, and that's her "I'm voting with mommy" thing.
Awesome. Beautiful.
Debbie, thank you so much, and congrats on the wedding.
Thank you. Thank you for including me. Thank you.
Of course. Bye-bye.